Hello, I'm glad you've joined us today. I'm hungry. I'm looking for a snack. Let me see. Oh, check it out. We got some olives here. Oh, I am hungry, but gross. I don't like olives. I've got an idea. Check this out. I got an idea. I'll just change the label on it and I'll make it Pringles. I love me some Pringles. I believe I'll have me some. Let me see. No. That's not gonna cross my lips. Well, I admit it. It's pretty silly of me to think that I could make this jar of olives taste like Pringle chips just by changing the label on the outside to make this jar look good. Like it's really gonna change the taste of these olives on the inside of this jar. And guess what? You'll never guess. Reminds me of a story. So, let's see. Today, we're going to learn about Jesus doesn't want us to pretend to love him. We'll meet some men in the Bible who acted like they loved God a lot, but it was all about how they looked. We're going to learn about Pharisees. The Pharisees were teachers of the law in the Bible times. They made themselves look really good to other people. The Pharisees looked good on the outside, but it was the inside that they really didn't love God. Jesus doesn't want us to pretend to love him, but that's the way they were doing. Jesus even told them they looked good and important on the outside, but they were filthy on the inside. Plus, the Pharisees hated Jesus. They were always looking for ways to trap him. They pretended to love God, but they didn't recognize that Jesus is God. I'm going to name something the Pharisees did. Follow along with me at home and give me a thumbs up or a thumbs down to show whether or not you think it sounds like a really good thing to do. All right, here it is. They taught people about God. Thumbs up, right? Teaching people about God sounds good, right? It really does. In fact, Jesus taught people about God all the time. But Jesus didn't like the way the Pharisees did it. The Pharisees loved to teach about God's law. Not just the 10 Commandments, but all of God's laws about how the Jewish people should live. But not just all the laws. To make sure that everyone was following all of God's laws just the right way, they added things. Lots of things. Let's see what the Bible says was so bad about what the Pharisees taught. In Matthew chapter 23, verse 2 through 4, it reads, "The teachers of the law and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. So you must be careful to do everything they tell you. But do not do what they do, for they do not practice what they preach. They tie up heavy, cumbersome loads and put them on other people's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to lift a finger to move them." The problem with the Pharisees was they added a lot of rules to God's rules. God said not to work on the Sabbath, God's special day. But the Pharisees added 39 categories of what work meant. They even said you can't pick wheat to eat if you're hungry on that day. The Pharisees taught that it was very important not to eat gnats, so they have to strain out any water you drank in case there's a gnat in it. The Pharisee says you have to fast a lot. Now fasting is when you don't eat food for a while. The Pharisee said you can't swear by God's temple, but if you swear by the gold in the temple, you can't go back on that promise. They were putting more emphasis on the gold in the temple. Pharisee says you have to really, really, really be clean. There's a lot of other rules too. The Pharisees added thousands of laws to God. It would have been very difficult to live with the Pharisees telling you what to do all the time. Just think about it. If we were to play a game of, say, Simon Says, or to better go along with our story, we'll call it Pharisees Says, and play the role of the Pharisees. And again, if I give you a list of things, rules to do, and oh, by the way, was more than one Pharisee, so at the same time, someone else like Pastor Daniel will be giving instructions as well. Could you keep up? Well, for example, if I say, Pharisee says, stand up, raise your hand, turn around in circles, lower your hand. At the very same time, Pastor Daniel's saying, Pharisee says freeze, say your ABCs, roar like a lion. Would you miss any of the commands? What would it be like having so many commands to follow? Do you think it was fair that this Pharisee game, a Pharisee says game, that the Pharisees were expecting you to be able to do all the commands, when in fact we as acting Pharisees didn't do it ourselves? The Pharisees would act like they love God by talking about how important it is to follow his rule. But inside, they really didn't love God, and they didn't like Jesus. They were always looking for ways to trap him. They pretended to love God, but they didn't recognize Jesus as God. In Matthew chapter 22, verses 35 through 40, it says, let's read. And one of them, an expert in the law, asked a question to test him. Teacher, which command in the law is the greatest? He said to them, love the Lord with your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. And this is the greatest and most important command. The second is like, love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets depend on these two commands. Now, Jesus explained that loving God and loving people are most important rules, and everything should be based on that. The problem with the Pharisees was that they had added lots of rules to God's rules. They sort of forgot about what God said about love, and instead they focused on all kinds of other things. They didn't help people at all. The Pharisees taught that the Bible was a bunch of rules, and that they crushed the people with heavy burdens. That's not what the Bible is about. Jesus doesn't want us to pretend to love him by just following a bunch of rules. Here's something else the Pharisees did. They tried to sit at the most important seat at the table, the head of the table. Matthew 23:6 says, they loved the place of honor at banquets, the front seat in the synagogues. Have you ever tried to do things just to be seen? Look at me, and like no one else mattered? Let's see what Jesus says about that. Matthew 23, verse 11 through 12. The greatest among you will be your servant. Whoever exalts, which means to rise up, himself will be humbled, and whoever humbles himself will be exalted. Jesus doesn't want us to pretend to love him by making ourselves look important. Here's something else the Pharisees did. Are you ready with your thumbs up or your thumbs down? They traveled to tell other people about God. Oh, it sounds like a thumbs up. Going to other places to tell about your faith seems right. And it's great, right? We might know missionaries who do that, but listen to what happened when the Pharisees shared about God. The Pharisees didn't believe that Jesus is God. Remember, they hated him. So when they went to other countries to tell about God, they weren't sharing the good news about Jesus. They shared a list of rules that was impossible to follow. They were making it harder for people to know and love God. They were slamming the door to heaven right in their faces. Jesus doesn't want people to be left out of his kingdom because they think they can't be good enough. We don't have to be perfect, and by far means we will never be perfect. We just need to love Jesus. Jesus doesn't want us to pretend to love him. Here's something else the Pharisees did. They gave some money of their money to God. Does that sound good or bad? Giving God money from your income is called tithing. The Bible tells us to tithe. But Jesus had something to say about that, about the way the Pharisees was given money. Matthew chapter 23, verse 23 and 24. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You give 1/10 of your spices, mint, dill, and cumin, but you have neglected the more important matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faithfulness. You should have practiced the latter without neglecting the former. You blind guides, you strain out the gnats, but you swallow a camel. Well, the Pharisees were being very, very careful to give tithe of every penny they earn, but they weren't doing something even more important, loving people and showing them mercy. Jesus said that it's like picking a gnat out of your drink and then swallowing a whole camel. Jesus loves us and wants us to love him back, not just pretend like we do. Now, we've seen that Jesus doesn't want us to pretend to love him. The Pharisees pretended to love God, but what does it look like to really love Jesus? Think about it this way. Picture a person you really love. You got that person? Okay. We can show God we love him just like we show those people we love them. Let's take a moment to ask God to look at our hearts. Do we sometimes just pretend to love him? It's easy to sit here and talk about how bad the Pharisees were, but we need to hear Jesus' word too. Let's ask God to show you what's in your heart. How are you pretending to love him? The Pharisees didn't love God the most. They pretended to, but Jesus doesn't want us to pretend. They didn't love other people the most. They just gave them impossible lists of rules and never showed love or compassion. The Pharisees loved themselves the most. They cared the most about their own images, about looking good to other people. Jesus said the Pharisees looked good and clean on the outside, but that's not what was in their hearts. Only you and God can see what's really in your heart. If you're doing things that just look good, or if you're doing them because you, are you doing them because you love Jesus? If you're more concerned about looking good to people than God, you might be acting like a Pharisees. Don't be a Pharisee. Well, remember, if you weren't able to join us today in person for children's worship, we will be meeting every second and fourth Sunday in the Lord Fellowship Hall. Hope to see you there. Goodbye.